Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to a new interview at Room for Discussion. Today we dive into the world of economic and ethical questions related to the pharmaceutical industry.
Questions such as, what is the justification for their high prices? And why do they need patents? And what is the monetary value of a human life?
We discuss these and more questions with an expert in the field. This super doctor has published over 700 articles in international scientific journals. He has received various research awards and was declared Dutchman of the Year in 2016 by Elsevier.
As a CEO and doctor of UCL, he knows all about the virtues and vices of big pharma. And we encourage you to join our discussion as well, using the microphone at the back with Lauren or via Twitter using #RFD.
For now, please welcome Dr. Marcel Levi.
Hello.
Hi, welcome.
When you came to UCL last year, the British Medical Journal, look at this, you know this one. You were displayed on the British Medical Journal on a soccer card with an orange shirt on, and on it was written world-class star. That's quite a compliment.
Yes, it's quite a compliment. I was really proud, although the Dutch soccer team is actually not, the best soccer team in the world anymore. But still, yes, I was quite proud.
But I understand that it puts quite a pressure on you.
Not particularly, but maybe it should have, but it didn't.
Well, that's good news. That's good news that you wasn't influenced by that. About your job as a CEO, contrary to many other medical CEOs, you still see patients as well. Do you think that's important in your capacity as a CEO?
Yes, there are several reasons for doing that. In the first place, if you see patients yourself and if you work during the night in a busy emergency department or in an acute medicine department, you really know how your hospital is working. In a big organization, if you are a CEO, all kind of people come to you and tell you all kind of different stories, things that are good, things that are bad, but it's not always exactly true. And it's very good to experience it yourself.
Yeah.
So that's one reason. The second reason is that the doctors and the nurses and the other healthcare professionals in the hospital really like it. They say, well, we finally have somebody who is high in the organization, who really understands what's going on in the organization, who understands what makes us happy. He understands what's frustrating us. So it's also for that. It's actually for the staff. It's a positive thing. And the third reason is that I absolutely like it. So, and that's the reason I don't want to give it up.
Because we've seen a lot of CEOs on our couch, and most of them never work on the floor. Do you think you cannot be a good CEO if you do not work on the floor?
No, I think that's a little bit exaggerated. And my experience, of course, is limited to healthcare. I think it is extremely difficult to be a CEO of a big hospital organization or a healthcare organization if you do not have any healthcare experience. But it may be experience in the past, it may be any experience. It should not always be hands-on. In my case, the thing that works best is to be a hands-on doctor and to understand what's going on in the organization. So to give you an example, before I was CEO in London, I was CEO in Amsterdam, but before that I was just a doctor in the AMC. Head of the Department of Medicine. And if I really wanted something, I went to the then CEO, who was not a doctor, and I said, I need to have this budget or this machine. If not, patients are going to die.
Was it true?
No, of course it was not true. But what could she tell?
Yeah.
So I got my machine and my budget. But
so do people get to lie to you as well? Do you catch them lying?
So if I'm now in my CEO office and the head of surgery comes to me and say, we need a new robot to do surgery. If not, patients are going to die. It's very easy for me to say, well, I don't think so. And that's the end of the discussion.
Yeah, all right. Those are good reasons to keep on working as a doctor. But we're here to talk about big pharma. And when you say big pharma, then a lot of people think about the high prices and the long patent protection. So we want to start this interview by looking at patents. Do they work and are they ethically justified? We want to give pharma a voice as well. So we will now paraphrase a statement of Richard Epstein. He's a professor of law at NYU, and he defends the current patent system in favor of pharma.
Research and development for drugs is very complicated. We start 10 researches, and in 3 out of 10 cases, we actually find a working molecule. Then you still have to prove that the drug is safe and effective. So many clinical trials and animal testing follows. After 20 years of investment and research, the drug might not make it through these trials, and then you are still left with nothing. Patents give us the guarantee that we will be able to get the return on investment for the drug and all failed researches. Without patents, no one would invest in this insecure industry.
Yeah, so do you agree that without patents, no one would invest in pharma?
Basically, yes. I think most money that comes from, for the development of drugs comes from investors who take a risk. And then, well, I'm not an economist, but I do understand that they want to have a return on investment. So there's nothing wrong with that. But I really get tired when these people from the pharma industry or others start everything they say by saying, it's so complex to make a medicine. It is not complex to make a medicine. Please accept. So that's one.
All right.
And the next thing is, they always say, well, we have, for each success, we have 20 failures. Why do we accept that?
Because it isn't true?
Because, well, it is true, probably, but it's actually demonstrate the utter inefficiency of the pharma industry. If only 1 in every 25% is a success, you may think by yourself, well, maybe you shouldn't have started 10 of these 20.
But that's also difficult because the research for a new drug, that's not a straight road, right? For example, for hepatitis C, the research lasted 25 years. I'm actually, as a consumer, very glad that they don't stop every time something doesn't seem successful.
Yeah. So sometimes it takes a long time. But what I see from my observation is that sometimes they pursue a target which you know already in a very early phase that it's not going to be successful. But then for a very, very long time, all these different phases are being, because they don't want to say to their investors that it's a failure. So they stop much too late. So I think for most of the failures in pharma industry, and the successful pharma industries will probably support that statement, the whole idea is to identify in a very early stage that a medicine is not going to make it and stop it.
Yeah, so that could have been prevented, is what you say. But if we look at this from an ethical perspective, just at patents, do you believe that you should be allowed to patent something that's essential for the survival of others?
That's a difficult discussion. I think if you really want to have that ethical discussion, at the end it may be that you would not allow patents for anything in healthcare and would say, well, this is just a matter of solidarity. But if you say that, then you have to think, who is going to invest in innovations? It's certainly not people who want to make a profit, because they cannot protect their invention, and they cannot protect their investment, and they cannot get any return on the investment.
That's a difficult argument, because Tesla makes electric cars, which I don't know how that works, but that seems a bit difficult as well, right? And they gave up their patents for the greater good of the environment. So if Tesla can do it, why can pharma not?
Well, I think it is all relative, and I'm not completely sure that Tesla is actually completely gave up their profit, but
their
it may
patents.
be an interesting
Yeah, they
example.
said all our patents
On
belong
the
to you.
electric cars.
Yeah, all our patents belong to you.
After making a huge profit, probably in the beginning. But that actually underlines the point I want to make. There's nothing wrong with patents and protection and return on investment, but I think in the case of the pharma industry, it has completely gotten out of hand. And it may well be that if you have invested, that you want to have your money back and a little bit of profit, a few percent, which is normal for each and every other industry. But in the case of pharma, patents last endlessly. The return on investment is enormous, much bigger than what we would accept from any other industry, car industry, computer industry, and so forth and so on. Maybe only paralleled by banks before the bank crisis, but we don't allow that from banks anymore. So why do we still allow this from pharmaceutical companies?
And besides that, there's also a really big difference between luxury goods and essential goods.
Yeah, and that's the second difficult point. if we talk about cars, you can decide whether you are going to buy a car, a Tesla or anything else, or you want to have a cheaper car, or maybe you want to have no car because you do not have the money for it, or you do not want to spend the money for it. In case of expensive medications, sometimes you have no choice. You have an illness, you're probably going to die from the illness, and then there is a drug that may actually either save your life or prolong your life in a significant way. What kind of choice do you have? You want to have that regardless of what it costs.
Yeah.
No choice.
You have also suggested patent regulations, right? That's something that you are in favor of. What kind of patent regulations are you in favor of?
Well, you can restrict the duration of patents. A more difficult item would actually be that you couple your patent to the amount of money that you allow an industry to make on a certain patent or a certain drug, which would mean maximum prices or something like that. I'm actually not extremely in favor of all these solutions because I think they're difficult, they're legally difficult, they're probably practically difficult. My preferred option would be that the industry would seriously look at itself and say, okay, if we want to sustain for the longer future, we have to behave differently. And if we don't, because if they don't do that, then I think the politicians and the society at large will actually not accept anymore what's going on right now.
Okay, so what should we do about the patents?
I think, well, the duration of patents is a big item. As soon as a patent actually expires, you see that drug prices drop
85%.
85%, yeah.
Enormously. So patents are extremely important. And I think patents are only there to allow somebody to gain back the money that has been invested with a acceptable profit, of course.
But the duration of pharmaceutical patents, you said that they are very long. If we compare them to technological patents, they're actually in effect shorter because the patents start before clinical trials and they last 10 to 12 years as well.
Yeah. Yeah, so and that is because the development of drug does take quite some time. So as soon as you patent a molecule, which is going to be a pharmaceutical agent, it may take a little bit longer until you are actually earning some money. So that means that they have a longer life than the usual patents. But a very good example is actually what happened with the orphan diseases. An orphan disease is a disease which is rare, and there's only a very small group of patients that are suffering from these diseases. So basically not the most interesting part to invest money and to develop drugs. To stimulate drug development for orphan diseases, both in the United States and in Europe, we had new orphan drug legislation, and that actually made it much more attractive to invest in this because the whole trajectory for registration and license of a drug became much smaller, and the patents actually, in contrast, became much longer. And then there was no cap on pricing whatsoever. So with this, well, interesting cocktail, actually the number of drugs for orphan diseases exploded. Fantastic. That was exactly what we wanted. But also the price of orphan drugs became almost unsustainable. And we're talking about hundreds and thousands of euros, and sometimes for one disease, one drug, even €1 million.
Yeah. Yeah, that's an interesting cocktail that you talk about, because the cocktail between having patent protection and being able to ask high prices, because you have a monopoly.
And a short development time.
And yeah, that's actually one of the reasons that a lot of people are very critical towards pharma. So let's look at the pricing problem itself now. Yeah.
Because over the past couple of years, many medicines that cure severe diseases had come to the market. So, for instance, hepatitis C, which is a drug that you can produce for €1.50, but they come on the market for €1,000 a tablet. How much less could they ask, do you think?
Well, that's a fantastic example. But let's first start, because I want to emphasize one thing. Hepatitis C is an infection of the liver due to a virus. It's a nasty disease. It makes you ill. It destroys your liver, and you're going to die. It'll take 15 to 20 years, but this is going to happen, and it's not a nice 15 to 20 years. And it was difficult to treat until a couple of years ago, and a new drug came on the market, which cures hepatitis C in more than 99% of patients. It has hardly any side effect. So this is a good news
thing.
story.
Yeah.
It's fantastic. Now about the price. That's excessive because the development, so for this particular drug, the development was not actually very costly. It was a combination of drugs that had already been developed for a long time before. The production of the drug is extremely cheap. And also, you don't need any marketing for a highly effective drug because everybody wanted to have it. So there was hardly any cost. So to ask for a 3-month treatment, 80,000 euro, which is actually the list price, is excessive. In India and Egypt, you can buy it for 1% or less of that price.
So looking at the research and development, you say that's really easy. We've read that Gilead has spent $11 billion developing the drug. That sounds to me like a lot of money that you probably want to earn back.
No, they didn't spend 11 billion. I know exactly the figure. They spent 4 billion actually buying the drug and the IP from another company. And they
Still
make
a lot of money, right?
every year a profit of 15 billion.
Yeah, but
every year.
that profit incentive, like it's really easy to say to pharma, you shouldn't be allowed to make profit on like ill people, but that is an incentive for them to innovate in the future and to make sure that they create more good drugs like hepatitis C.
In an ideal world, of course Gilead would have gained back their investments, and of course they were allowed to make a nice profit because they actually took a risk and they developed a fantastic drug. But this is absolutely excessive. And where does it lead to if the drugs are so expensive as they are, even in a country as in the Netherlands, the drug is actually not accessible to patients anymore because people will come up with many, many reasons that it's not going to be reimbursed, it's not going to be accessible. We are only going to give it to the most severe patients and not to the less severe patients. So actually we have this fantastic drug. We can make Netherlands and other Western European countries, but I think the Netherlands should easily be the first totally hepatitis C free. We could be the first hepatitis C free country in the world if it would only cost 25%. And even in that situation, a company like Gilead would make millions or even billions of profit.
And you
So
think that would be
60,000 money, 60,000 euros.
Well, that's an interesting story. It cost, the list price was 80,000. So first our minister, the then Minister of Healthcare, Minister Schippers, decided that it was too expensive. So she said, we are only going to give it to the patients with the most severe form of hepatitis C or the most advanced form of hepatitis C. It's a little bit saying to patients, your house is on fire, you can call the fire brigade, and the fire brigade will come next week or so. So not very nice to patients. So there was lots of pressure on the minister to actually allow it to all patients with hepatitis C infection. And then she started price negotiations with the firm, which was actually quite effective. So she was able to lower the price somewhat. The interesting thing is that the prices are then become secret. Nobody is allowed to know what the prices are because Gilead is afraid that if the Belgian people know what the Dutch people pay, they also have to lower the price in Belgium, and then they have to lower the price in Germany, and so forth and so on. Well, the secret was not a real secret because in the AMC we had many patients with hepatitis C and we bought the drug and we just could see what was on the invoice. So we knew exactly that Mr. Schippers actually reduced the price from 80,000 to about somewhat less than 60,000. Quite effective, quite successful, but therefore we could treat many more patients.
Yeah. What I don't really understand is that there's a lot of criticism for the price, that the medication is too expensive. But what Pharma says is the alternative is much more expensive, namely treating someone at the end stages of liver disease. Why are we as a society willing to pay for that, but are we like very critical when we have a cure for less money?
Yeah, this is an interesting debate. So we have a drug. And the drug has production cost, development cost. You want to make a little bit of profit, and you will have some marketing and sales costs. And I would say that would determine the price of a drug. The pharma company said, no, the price of the drug is being determined on the amount of money that we spend now on a certain disease.
Yeah.
And that will actually determine the price of the drug.
Yeah, because comparatively, it's then better, it's cheaper.
Yeah, but that means that innovation will never make things cheaper. Everything will be the same or more expensive. So if you say, no, well, we just ask the price that it costs to produce it, to develop it, and a little bit of profit, then actually we could treat all patients with hepatitis C, and we could reduce healthcare costs by a substantial amount, because we don't need the cost of treating patients with advanced liver disease anymore.
Yeah.
So this is a fantastic example how innovation can actually make healthcare cheaper, but if you reason like the healthcare companies do, innovation will always make healthcare more expensive.
Yeah, yeah, that's interesting. So the money does exist, but it's a choice of where you actually want to put that money.
Well, if we don't spend then the money on patients with advanced liver disease anymore, we can spend them on children with cystic fibrosis, for which there is a new drug, which is also for which there was no drug before. So that is going to become a little bit more expensive.
Yeah.
So the money. There are many ways to spend the money. But it's a bit ridiculous to say that we will spend exactly the same amount of money that we did spend in a previous situation where we didn't have the drug.
Because there's a possibility now to
Yes.
reduce it. Okay, thank you. Are there any audience questions now? Yes.
I also have a question about the medication for cystic fibrosis. It has just been approved, and I'm a medical student as well here in Amsterdam. And what especially in the case with the hepatitis C medication, the price negotiations, they stay secret. It's the same as cystic fibrosis. Do you think that's a good thing, or would you like it to be an open discussion as well?
Yeah, I don't think that secret prices is a good thing. It will lead to all kind of difficult discussions. I think pharma companies operate in an international market. There's nothing wrong about that. I think we should have complete transparency about prices and about a reduction in prices. And I do not actually understand why everything is being kept as a secret, because it actually is an impediment for further dissemination of the drug, also to countries who have lower budgets for healthcare and then have difficulties in actually paying for the drug.
Thank you for your question.
Also one in the back. Yeah.
Well, thank you. And I have two questions, actually. First one is, isn't this just a temporary problem? Because whenever there is no patent anymore on a certain drug, the monopoly on the drug doesn't apply anymore. So after 30 years or so, or even less, like 10 years or so, when the patent doesn't apply anymore, the cost for a drug should be lower. So we don't have the problem anymore. Second.
Yeah.
Well, let's take it one by one, yeah?
Yeah, I think basically you're right. So I just said as soon as the patent is expired, the prices drop. There will be competitors on the market and everything is much, much cheaper. But I find it a little bit difficult to say to a patient with lung cancer, well, I'm sorry, you should have had your lung cancer in 10 years from now, but now you're going to die because we cannot pay the medication for you. Yeah. So this 10 years is very long for patients who are going to lose their renal transplant, who are going to die from cancer, who are going to have serious disabling disease. So I think it is a problem.
Yeah. All right. We will come back to you later. So if you have questions, memorize them, and then you'll have an opportunity in a few minutes. So we've just talked about patents and pricing, but the money incentive of pharma has impacts beyond that. A lot of critical notions are that pharma doesn't want to develop medication that is not profitable. For example, for rare diseases or for poorer people. Yeah, let's look into that now.
Yeah, because there's a theory circulating on the internet, for instance, that there's a cure for cancer, but that pharma doesn't want to bring it to the market because of their money incentives. Do you think that's true? Oh,
there are many conspiracies on the internet, I think. I don't think that's true. There's a very large number of serious investigators, mostly in universities, who do cancer research. I think they would know if there would be something like that.
Yeah, okay, this is not a well-substantiated theory, but however, we've come to many articles that say that the pharmaceutical industry prefers to invest in treatments instead of cures, because when you cure something...
Well, I think that's a bit of a conspiracy, and it's also not proven. I'm not a big fan of the pharmaceutical industry, but we should also not make them look worse than they actually are. Of course, they like medication that patients have to take for years and years and years and years, because that's a guaranteed income. I do not, and that sometimes influences the way they design trials. I'm not completely sure. It affects their choices in what kind of drugs they're going to develop.
But why wouldn't that be the case? Because we just established that they are willing to ask such high prices that people actually are going to die because the medication is not accessible. But now you stand up for them and say, well, they won't do this. But I don't get that.
Well, you can call me naive. Maybe it does happen. I think it's a very simple industry. They just want to make money. They want to make drugs. They want to make as much money as possible. They want to, and you can make a lot of money either by raising the price tremendously if you have a medication that actually people really need, but you can also make a lot of money by developing a medication that patients need to take for a very long time. So it's one way or the other.
Yeah.
I think at the end of it's all about money and how much money you can earn.
So that's their highest priority. Because we've seen many diseases such as MS, asthma, Alzheimer's, that are not cured yet.
Yeah, although I think it's not completely fair. They want to make as much money as possible. I think that's and they're very open about that. They have stakeholders and people who actually invested in them. So that's their priority. If we say, well, but our priority as a society is actually to have much more drugs available for dementia or for other diseases that we really care about, we should invest in drug development. But if you look very seriously, society hardly invests anything in drug development. So it's a choice, I think.
Yeah. So let's look at another theory, a little bit better substantiated, that we want to have your opinion about. One of your colleagues, John Ashton, the president of the UK Faculty of Public Health, he said the pharmaceutical companies are unwilling to invest in vaccines and research to cure Ebola because it is only killing Africans. Do you agree with that?
Well, it is yes. I think literally, I think he's right. It is a little bit bold to state it that way. I like more to say they are not going to invest in a drug when there is no return on investment. And if the drug is for a disease that only affects poor people in poor countries, they're not going to do this. And then you can say, well, this is black Africans, and then it's all kind of racism and all those things. But it has nothing to do with racism. It's just
their money incentive.
Cold calculation.
Yeah, well, the thing is that they did start their research into the vaccine for Ebola before Westerners got infected.
Yeah.
So how, according to your logic, that wouldn't happen, right?
I think so. But on the other hand, if I would a pharmaceutical company and I would develop a vaccine for Ebola, and a very large part of Africa would be vaccinated with this vaccine, you still make a lot of money, even when it's cheap. There's a lot of people living in Africa, so even when it's only $2 or $3 per vaccine, you make a lot of money from that.
Yeah, so you think that they could still have a profit incentive even if it's for poorer people?
Yes, but since their profit threshold is set at such a high level, they actually do not do things that will raise a decent profit, but actually they can make much more profit in other areas.
Yeah, so that actually shows very big global issues, because we can see, based on this answer, pharma is kind of like a god who decides who gets to live and who gets to die, who deserves the medication.
Well, but let's be honest, we let them do that.
Yeah.
Because we, as a society, do not invest in new drugs at all.
Yeah, we want to talk about that now, actually, about a different way to look at that.
Yeah, because we always criticize pharma for asking high prices, but there's another way to look at it, as you already said. Because to what extent should society pay for these expensive treatments?
Yeah, well, that's a very difficult discussion, and I think so we have all these discussions, even in our country, which is extremely rich, that we do not want to spend more than €80,000 per saved life year, and then there is a quality adjustment to that as well. And personally, I think that it's never going to lead to a conclusion. we will always pay for drugs. So I would focus much more on the maximum price and on the amount of money that we want to spend on
Do you think that everyone's life should be saved at all costs?
I think in a healthcare system that is based on solidarity, and in a country that is as rich as our country, I think that is a fair conclusion.
And also, when you compare life prolonging to life quality medicines?
Well, you need to be realistic, I think. And if a drug will only give a prolongation of life of, let's say, 3 or 4 weeks, sometimes in combination with the deterioration of the quality of life, I think the discussion could be, well, we are not going to do this. But that's not a financial discussion, that's
not
a
at all?
medical discussion, I think. This is not a good drug for patients because it's not going to give them any gain in terms of prolongation and life expectancy and quality of life, and it's going to hurt them. So, had nothing to do with money, it's just not a good idea to give that medication or that treatment to that patient.
So you're not in favor of prolonging a life that is that has less quality?
I think, well, it's not for me to decide. I think patients should decide for themselves.
But what would you
But
advise
as a
them?
doctor?
Yes, but as a doctor you can give them some guidance. And you can say, well, this drug, lung cancer is a very good example, chemotherapy and lung cancer. Everybody knows that chemotherapy and lung cancer only works a little bit for a short while, and most patients are going to die fairly rapidly. So you should say to your patient, this is only going to prolong your life with 3 months, and there is a huge price to pay, not a financial price, but a price in terms of not feeling well because of the medication, going to the hospital 3 times a week, having complications in the middle of the night because there is fever, going to the emergency department, waiting for hours, and then go home. So this is going to spoil your last 3 months in life.
Yeah.
Do you want that, or will you not take that drug, which means you will not live for another 3 months, but maybe for 1 month, but with a much better quality of life.
Yeah.
And although I think that we are having increasingly we will increasingly having this discussion with patients, it's still in its infancy.
Yeah, this might be a controversial question to ask, but would you then also be in favor of euthanasia to actively end a life that has a low quality of life?
It has nothing to do with euthanasia.
Why not?
This is just medical treatment for patients with a disease, or not.
Yeah.
Euthanasia is actually actively terminating life for patients who suffer.
Yeah.
It's completely different
There's,
discussion.
I see that there's a difference, but there's also something that compares the two, namely, if someone has a very horrible quality of life, namely suffering, for example,
And
you
decide
would
not to
say,
cure them.
I don't want to prolong that life, but would you also say, would you also facilitate ending that life?
That's actually, everything there is the decision of the patient. And if a patient comes to me, lung cancer is a very good example, and I would actually tell the patient that we do not have a lot to offer that's really going to help him in terms of life expectancy. Many patients are afraid that that's the end and they won't get any help from doctors anymore. But you can do a lot of things in terms of supportive treatment. If, despite the supportive treatment, the disease will progress and the patient comes in a terrible condition, is going to die in a few weeks, but in the meantime is really suffering every day, and then asks to you, can you terminate my life? And then we're talking about euthanasia. I think most doctors in the Netherlands, including myself, would actually agree to that. And that happens now and then.
Yeah, so there's the choice of the patient, but you as a doctor are willing to facilitate that if that's necessary.
Yes, that's actually how euthanasia is organized in the Netherlands.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Medication for rare diseases like Pomp and Hunters costs 200,000 to 300,000 per person each year. Shouldn't there be a cap on those high prices, that like a maximum on us to spend?
That do improve life quality, but that are very expensive.
Yeah, I think there is no reason why these drugs are so expensive. No reason at all. My own specialty is, because these are examples that are very often quoted, and then people start to debate. But I can give you an alternative example. My specialty is clotting, blood clotting, and I treat boys, it's always boys, with hemophilia, who do have, they miss a coagulation factor, and therefore they have terrible bleeding, spontaneous bleeding, and you can treat them with coagulation factor concentrates, which are not very expensive to make. And we spend 400,000 to 500,000 euro every year on them. And there is no debate about that, because it's extremely effective. They can live a totally normal life with this therapy.
Okay, but if you take that example, still, do you think there should be a cap on it to pay for as a society? Because it puts a big burden on society.
I think we have come to a point that if the industry is not going to reduce the prices themselves, we may come to a situation that we say, well, we are going to pay, this is the maximum we are going to pay, and if not, you cannot market your drug in our country. And the interesting discussion is then, and you may have seen this on TV a couple of weeks ago, is that the industry then says, well, if that's the case, the Netherlands, then we're not going to allow our drug in your market. And that is never going to happen, because one thing, I'm not an economic specialist, but there is one thing important for pharma companies, and that is market share. So they will always market their drug in the Netherlands, even when it's only 17 million inhabitants.
Yeah.
So
So then let's look at that situation. Imagine that pharma would ask reasonable prices. So this whole kind of like revolution thing happened, and pharma becomes reasonable, and they ask lower prices. Technology does get better, and medication does get more sophisticated, so it's easy to assume that drugs also become more expensive in the future, even at reasonable prices. Do you, at that time, also believe that there should never be a cap on the amount of money a human life is worth?
Yeah, because I cannot see how, with the technology that we have, and that also gets better and better every few years, I cannot see that we will ever have to pay the excessive prices that we pay now. So for highly effective medication that we already have for decades, we pay 10,000 euros per year, 20,000 euro per year, and nobody's complaining. That's something that we can really afford to pay for our patients. Very good example is HIV infection. We have many HIV-infected patients in the Netherlands. The medication is certainly not cheap. So we probably spent in that order of magnitude for HIV-infected patients. But there is no debate whatsoever about that.
Yeah. And why is that?
Because it's good. It saves their life. It is okay. It's really expensive, but it's sometimes justified. And nobody's complaining about that.
So as long as the price is justified, we could pay like €1 million for one person for a
But
year.
it will never be 1 million, because it is actually not very difficult to make drugs. Even when it's monoclonal antibodies or small molecules or antisense, or that's even the most cheapest drug I can think of, it is actually not going. It will never be that expensive.
And if it is that expensive, we should not accept it, and then they will drop their prices.
And if actually the price has no relationship whatsoever with development, production, and, well, the ordinary cost that a company can have, then we should not accept it.
Okay, well, that's an interesting point, and we would like to ask you if you have any questions. Yeah, over there.
Hi, thank you. Just a short comment. First on that drug companies say that the research and development is so costly, though that's why the price is so costly, but they do use a lot of their budget in marketing and lobbying, which is also probably costing the prices to be so high. And you said that the society is not using anything to do drug development, but a lot of the trials are done in universities, which are public institutions. So therefore, they are, of course, society has their own sort of gain. But my question is actually about medical education of medical students, and specifically the endocannabinoid system, which has been discovered with medical cannabis. Apparently, it's not even yet taught in medical schools, even though it's a sort of very basic physiology. And there's, of course, a lot of lobby from pharmaceutical company against medical cannabis because it's something that you can grow in your backyard. So this is sort of my question about that.
Yeah, well, although I think that I understand what you're saying, but the question is a little bit dated. I think medical students have come a very long way. They don't allow any sponsoring for pharmaceutical companies anymore for their social activities. Actually, there is quite some attention in the medical curriculum on the pricing of medication and the importance of the economics of pharmaceuticals, especially in the master course, and all medical students who actually become doctors do a master course. So I think they've come a long way. If they organize a congress, they don't want any pharmaceutical company to sponsor them anymore, and I think that's very good of them.
All right, any other questions? Yeah.
Assuming that the World Health Organization is an international not-for-profit organization, with most members being poor countries, Would it be possible for the medicines they need to develop them at that international level? And second question, would you have any recommendations to our Minister of Health to reduce costs? Thank you.
Okay. Well, first, the World Health Organization. I think the World Health Organization could be really helpful in identifying areas where we would need new drugs for all countries, not only the Western countries, but also the developing countries. I think it would be really difficult, even for nationalities, even for countries, to develop drugs. Because it is, we do not have the organization to do it, and we do not have the rigor to do it, and so far we actually do not have the investment, or do not want to spend the investment to make this happen. The World Health Organization, I think, is even in a worse state as an organization to do this. It's a highly politicized organization that will probably never be able to develop drug. But even a country, even for a country like the Netherlands, it will be extremely difficult to develop drugs. So I have nothing against the fact that this is done by private companies, which could in itself work. We are also not producing cars as a country, and we're also not producing computers. That's done by private companies. It works fairly well, basically speaking. So why wouldn't that be the case for drugs?
All right. We have time for one more. Yeah?
I assume you're familiar with the Fair Medicine initiative. Do you think that would be a solution?
Yeah, so the Fair Medicine initiative is actually exactly doing what, for me, the ideal situation would be. It actually tries to develop drugs and then market drugs, but only for the price that it has cost to invest in it and to develop them and to make them. And everybody who helps developing the drug will get their money back with a little bit of, maybe a little bit of profit. And that's exactly the situation where we need to come. So it's an interesting experiment, Dutch experiment, that's now being done. And if they prove it's going to work, it may actually revolutionize the world. But it's in a very early stage, so it's a little bit too early to tell. But so far, so good. And I think the drugs they are developing now are interesting examples, and it may work, actually.
Okay, Mr. Levi, we looked you up at the internet many times, and you've said many times that you think that medicines do not belong on the free market. Do you believe that the government should partially own the pharmaceutical industry?
Well, that may be an interesting approach. So the government could be a stakeholder in pharmaceutical companies and thereby hold pharmaceutical companies accountable for the way they behave in society. Mm-hmm. So that may actually be a mechanism that may work. But as far as I know, that's not being done now.
But you think that that would be, like, in a hypothetical situation, you would be in favor of partially owning the pharmaceutical industry?
Well, since it is partially a societal problem that we need to fix, and partly, and actually my statement that it's not a free market pertains to the fact that patients do not have a choice. In a free market, I think one of the pillars of a free market is, well, you can buy something, you can buy it cheaper, maybe you get less quality, or you don't buy it at all. But that's not the choice that most patients have. They have a disease and they need a treatment. So even by that fact alone, it can never be a free market.
But would partially owning it then solve that problem? Because you still have profit-driven investors, right? It sounds a bit like a semi-solution, but...
Yeah, but I think if governments would be a major stakeholder in pharmaceutical companies, it could keep companies to account and say, well, we also have a society responsibility. I'm just thinking about the parallel. I'm not sure this is the best example, but the state, and certainly the city of Amsterdam, is a stakeholder in Schiphol Airport, and thereby try to influence how this airport behaves and whether they take societal responsibility for the people who live in the area where the airport is. It is a system of checks and balances that may basically work well.
And concretely, the kind of behavior that you would like to check then is the prices they ask, the medication they choose to develop?
Exactly.
All right. But the thing is that if we look at the problem, like we've talked about, the prices are really high, but innovation is happening. Like we may not have a perfect system, but there are a lot of new cures that enter the market. You yourself have said this is the golden era for medication. Then is the problem really that big?
I agree with you that we do have new medication, that it is good news that we have treatment for many patients for which we had no treatment even 5 or 10 years ago. So fantastic. My big concern is that pricing is actually an impediment for access to medicine of many patients, mostly in poorer countries, but also in our country. So if a very expensive anti-cancer drug comes on the market and it has to be paid for by hospitals, hospitals very often find a reason to actually to come up with excuses that they can't give it, that they are going to delay it, that that particular patient should not have it. And I very often think that if the price would be much lower, we wouldn't have that debate, and many more patients would actually benefit from these new medications.
And how can you assume that the same level of innovation would occur if it would be partially state-owned?
Well, I mean, that's a ridiculous statement. So why can we only make new medicine if pharmaceutical companies have this very big profit margin? We only have new cars every year, and new computers, and new iPhones, and new everything, and even with a much smaller profit margin. So I think people would just accept it.
Yeah, because investors invest a lot of money, like we've talked about. Even though they may spend too much money on research and development, it's still not cheap. So they need investors with a profit incentive, and that's much less likely to occur if the state has a very big say in that.
I think investors will always find ways to invest their money, and they just go where the most money is, which is pharmaceutical companies. And if it would be less, it would be a trade-off. Am I going to invest in a car company, in an airline, or in a pharmaceutical company?
Yeah, but they'll probably be less likely to choose for pharma then.
Well, I'm not against decent profit margins for pharma investments. I'm just against excessive profit margins for pharma companies.
Yeah, I think this is actually like the core of the problem, that there is a trade-off between, on the one hand, innovation, and on the other hand, access for people.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. You have said that it's unbelievable that the Netherlands has transferred responsibility about something as vital as our healthcare to private companies. What do you think is the incentive of the government not to regulate now?
Well, that's the religion of the free market. So I think it was actually the advocates of the free market that made the move from towards a healthcare organization which is, well, mostly organized by private companies and private institutions. I think we now have sufficient evidence that it's actually not working because, one, it is not a free market. It's very artificial, and it is probably not yielding the gains that we thought it should have, particularly in quality improvement, but probably also in financial improvement.
And how influential do you think the pharma lobby is in this whole case?
Well, they are influential. So if you count the number of lobbyists in Brussels, that's an extremely impressive number. And they actually can make things difficult, like parallel import. So I told you that the hepatitis C medication is extremely cheap in Egypt. So why don't we send a truck to Egypt and buy it over there and then treat everybody in the Netherlands for less than 5% of the price that we pay now? Because there are all kind of rules, regulations and guidelines, European guidelines, that actually make that impossible. And I often think that it has been made impossible by legislators because they were influenced by lobbyists of the pharmaceutical companies, because there are not that many reasons why it should be impossible to import drugs from other countries.
Do you have other examples from lobbyists, what they do in Europe or in Holland?
Well, they have come to this very complex system of setting the price for medications. They actually make it very difficult to negotiate with different countries to lower the price of drugs in Europe. I think the big game changer is going to be that there is now major attention for drug prices in the United States. And we are in this area very often a follower of what's happening in the United States. So if there is real pressure on pharmaceutical companies over there and drug prices over there, I think Europe will follow. But it's a very slow and painful process.
And why do you think that the government listens to lobby? Like, why? What is their incentive to do what the lobbyists say if it's about something as important as health?
I'm not. I don't know. You should ask that to a psychologist or a politicologist. The only thing I know, but this may be a stupid answer, is lobbying probably works because that's the reason there are so many lobbyists. If it wouldn't work, well, nobody would actually pay for lobbyists.
Yeah.
And how can we prevent this lobby from happening? Can we do that?
It's very difficult because you can actually, so you can block access and you can say you are not allowed to talk to them, but how can?
That's not
and
really
sometimes
possible.
it's not always clear who is a lobbyist and who is not. It's not that they come in and say, hi, I'm
a
here to
lobbyist."
defend, I'm lobbying for Pfizer. So they come under different names and different colors, and they may be the organization for the benefit of patients with lung cancer, but actually they could be drug lobbyists.
Yeah.
It's a complicated world with lobbyists. Okay, you once said in an interview, of course, sometimes I would like to be Minister of Public Health because there's so much room for improvement. But I'm not that old and becoming a minister is always a possibility in the future. So, as a possible future minister, what could you improve?
Oh, well.
Because there was a lot of criticism for Madam Schippers. Is there things that you would do differently?
Okay, well, I think one thing really important, and I'm not sure it's an answer to your question. So if you look at our parliament and our parliamentarians that can ask questions to ministers, healthcare attracts a lot of attention. And Minister Schippers was actually the minister with the most questions from parliament year in, year out over the last 5 years. But if you critically look at the answers she gives, 80% of her answer is, I'm not in charge. Why do you ask me? It's the healthcare insurers, it's the hospitals, it's the medical organizations. So she said all the time, I'm not in charge. So we actually had a minister who was actually not a minister. Or she was a minister, of course, but she was not taking any responsibility for anything that was going on in healthcare.
How would you do that differently?
I think a minister of healthcare should take responsibility, even in the system that we have, for things that are not going well in healthcare. What's not going well in healthcare? Well, for example, look at our emergency departments in the Netherlands. Overcrowded, old people, not finding, there's not, very difficult in finding a hospital bed for them, actually not very well being taken care of at home, so they only can go to the hospital even for minor problems, and nobody takes responsibilities. Maybe the hospitals want to take responsibility, but they are not allowed to work together because of the competition authority. The health insurance company may want to take some initiative there, but they're actually not allowed to do that. And they are very anxious to lose patients who buy insurance policies from them, and the government's not doing anything. So I often look back to another Minister of Health a long time ago, which was Minister Borst, and she was a doctor. And actually she made very important decision, taking responsibility, for example, patients with HIV infection and access to medication, and just by saying, I'm going to do this, regardless of the system and regardless of the regulation.
Do you think that it's important that you are a doctor as well when you become a
well, that's actually what this peculiar guy Baudet was saying. So I don't think you have to be a general to be the Minister of Defense. But it helps at least to understand healthcare.
In healthcare,
and it could be a nurse, it could be anybody, to actually lead a healthcare organization. And this may include the minister.
Yeah, so maybe similarly to you being a CEO and still being a doctor, you think that same principle then also applies for a minister of healthcare?
So it would be fantastic if we would have a Minister of Health who would also 1 day per week be a nurse in a hospital and then really understands what happens with patients.
Well, that's
like
very,
you.
yeah, that's a very interesting proposal. So as a final question, when can we expect to see you again on our couch, but then as the Dutch Minister of Public Health?
Well, we just have a new Minister of Health.
So 4
even
years?
two.
4 years?
Well, I think it's really insecure to do any prediction. That's even more difficult than predicting the weather. And I just have a new job.
You're a bit busy now, but maybe...
So it's probably going to take a few years, and maybe it's never going to happen.
Okay, well, we'll keep you to that promise. If you are a minister, we will give you a call.
Yeah.
So before we thank our guest, we would like to ask you, if you want to interview people like Marcel Levi as well, then we have good news, because we are looking for interviewers. We will have drinks at CREA from 5 to 7 today, and you can ask all your questions to us. And you will also get a free drink, so there's not a real good reason not to be there. So we'll hope to see you all there.
But for now, let's give a warm round of applause to Marcel Levi.
Thank you. All right, so